The afternoon sun filtered through the grimy hospital windows, casting long shadows across the waiting room floor. 12-year-old Elijah sat motionless on the hard plastic chair, his small frame dwarfed by the institutional furniture. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something heavy and solemn that seemed to cling to everyone who entered. His grandmother, Ms. Purley, sat beside him, her weathered hand occasionally squeezing his, though Elijah barely felt it. Time moved strangely in this place. Minutes stretched into hours as doctors in white coats hurried past, their faces serious and their voices low. Elijah had been doing his math homework when his grandmother received the call. They hadn't even taken time to change clothes. He still wore his school uniform, the collar now damp with sweat after hours of waiting. Family of Vivian Wilson? Elijah looked up at the sound of his mother's name. A doctor stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, his face carefully arranged into what Elijah would later recognize as practiced sympathy. Ms. Purley stood, pulling Elijah up with her. "That's us," she said, her voice stronger than Elijah expected. "I'm her mother, and this is her son." The doctor nodded, gesturing toward a smaller room off the main waiting area. "Let's talk in private." The small conference room felt colder than the waiting area. The doctor, Dr. Nguyen, according to his name tag, sat across from them, his hands folded neatly on the table. "I'm very sorry to tell you this," he began, looking first at Miss Purley and then briefly at Elijah. "We did everything we could, but Vivian suffered what we call a cerebral aneurysm. It's when a blood vessel in the brain suddenly ruptures." Ms. Purley's grip tightened on Elijah's hand. "What are you saying, doctor?" "I'm saying that despite our best efforts, your daughter passed away 20 minutes ago." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Elijah stared at the doctor, waiting for more words. Different words, words that made sense. His mother, his vibrant, strong-willed, always singing mother, couldn't be gone. Just that morning, she had braided his hair, humming one of her favorite songs while he complained about being late for school. "There must be some mistake," Ms. Purley said, her voice cracking. "Vivian is only 34. She's healthy." Dr. Nguyen explained more, about how aneurysms could happen to anyone, about how Vivian had collapsed at work, about how the paramedics had tried to revive her. Elijah heard the words but couldn't process them. Instead, he focused on a small coffee stain on the doctor's coat, on the flickering fluorescent light above, on anything but what was being said. "Would you like to see her?" the doctor finally asked. Ms. Purley nodded slowly, but when she tried to stand, her legs seemed to give way. A nurse appeared. Had she been there all along? And helped steady her. "Elijah, baby, do you want to come?" his grandmother asked. Elijah shook his head. He couldn't, not yet, not until this strange dream ended and things went back to normal. "I'll stay with him," the nurse offered, and Ms. Purley followed Dr. Nguyen through another door. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, sat beside Elijah. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty comfort, just placed a small cup of water in front of him and waited. Elijah was grateful for her silence. 20 minutes later, or was it hours, Ms. Purley returned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks wet with tears. She moved like someone underwater, slow and disoriented. The nurse helped with paperwork, with phone calls, with arrangements Elijah didn't understand. Words like morgue and funeral home and death certificate floated around him. It was dark when they finally left the hospital. The drive home passed in silence, the familiar streets looking strange and foreign in the night. When they arrived at Ms. Purley's house, not home, not really, though Elijah and his mother had moved in 6 months ago when rent increased at their apartment, his grandmother guided him inside with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you hungry, baby?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Elijah shook his head. The thought of food made his stomach turn. "You should try to eat something," she insisted, but there was no force behind her words. She seemed as lost as he felt. The house phone rang, startling them both. Ms. Purley answered, and Elijah listened as she delivered the news to someone, an aunt, maybe, or one of his mother's friends. The conversation repeated 3 more times before Ms. Purley unplugged the phone. "Go get some sleep, child," she told him finally. Tomorrow will come, and we'll face it then." Elijah climbed the stairs to the small bedroom he used when staying at his grandmother's house. His mother's childhood bedroom was across the hall. Ms. Purley had kept it largely the same over the years, though Vivian had taken most of her personal belongings when she moved out at 19. Elijah paused at his mother's door, hand hovering over the knob before continuing to his own room. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in his school clothes, unable to summon the energy to change. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11:42 p.m. Less than 12 hours ago, his mother had been alive. The thought hit him with physical force, doubling him over. Sleep wouldn't come. Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his grandmother moving around downstairs. Around 1 in the morning, he heard her soft sobs floating up through the heating vent. The sound broke something inside him, but still he couldn't cry. The shock had frozen everything. Dawn came, gray light filtering through curtains his mother had sewn last Christmas. Elijah hadn't slept, but he got up anyway, changing his clothes mechanically before heading downstairs. Ms. Purley sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, a cold cup of coffee in front of her. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked when she saw him. Elijah shook his head. "Me neither." She pushed a sheet of paper toward him. "The funeral home needs a photo of your mama for the service. Could you find a good one? Maybe from last Christmas?" The task gave him purpose. Elijah nodded and went to the living room where photo albums filled a shelf. He pulled them down one by one, searching for the perfect image. His mother smiling on his 10th birthday. His mother graduating from nursing school. His mother holding him as a baby, her face young and full of wonder. Time passed as he flipped through pages of memories. Outside, cars began to arrive. Neighbors and church members brought food. Their voices hushed as they spoke to Ms. Purley in the kitchen. Elijah stayed with the photos, barely acknowledging the parade of sympathetic faces that peered in at him. "That boy needs to cry," he overheard Mrs. Washington from next door say to his grandmother. "It ain't healthy holding it all in like that." "He'll grieve in his own time," Ms. Purley responded, her voice tired but firm. Later that afternoon, as the house finally emptied of visitors, Elijah overheard his grandmother on the phone, her voice strained as she discussed finances. "No, we can't afford that," she was saying. "Just the basic service is stretching us thin. I understand it's what she would have wanted, but unless you're offering to pay the difference." That night, as Elijah lay in bed pretending to sleep, Ms. Purley came to check on him. She sat on the edge of his bed, her weight creating a dip in the mattress. Her hand, cool and dry, rested briefly on his forehead. "I know you're awake," she said softly, "and I know you're hurting in ways I can't fix. Your mama would know what to say. She always did." Her voice caught. "I'm doing the best I can, baby. We'll get through this somehow." After she left, Elijah turned toward the window, watching as clouds moved across the moon. He remembered his mother's stories about their heritage, about how their ancestors believed the dead needed proper rituals to guide their spirits home. Vivian had been proud of those traditions, though life in America had pulled her away from many of them. "Our people know how to honor death," she'd told him once after they attended a funeral for one of his classmates' parents. "Not hide from it like it's shameful. Death is just another journey, and the living have a responsibility to help prepare the way." The memory was so clear that for a moment, Elijah thought he'd heard her voice in the room. The reality of her absence crashed over him anew. 3 days had passed in a blur, and tomorrow they would begin making concrete arrangements. His mother would be buried in the local cemetery, far from her ancestral homeland, with none of the rituals she had respected. For the first time since hearing the news, Elijah felt something break through the numbness, a small, sharp pain that quickly grew, expanding in his chest until he could barely breathe. He pressed his face into the pillow as the first tears finally came, his body shaking with the force of his grief. In the darkness of his room, as cicadas sang outside and his grandmother's soft snores drifted from down the hall, Elijah made a silent promise to his mother. Somehow, some way, he would make sure she received the proper rites to guide her spirit home. 3 days passed in a blur of concerned neighbors and hushed conversations. The Wilson home had become a gathering place for mourners, the kitchen table perpetually covered with casserole dishes and pie tins. Elijah moved through it all like a ghost, accepting hugs from people he barely recognized, nodding at stories about his mother that sometimes didn't sound like her at all. "Your mama was a saint," said Mr. Porter from the church, patting Elijah's shoulder with a heavy hand. "Always thinking of others before herself." Elijah wanted to correct him. His mother hadn't been a saint. She'd been real, sometimes impatient, occasionally stubborn, fiercely protective. She'd worked double shifts at the hospital to pay the bills, coming home with dark circles under her eyes but still finding energy to help with his homework. She danced around the kitchen to old records, laughing when she forgot the steps. She'd argued with bill collectors on the phone and sometimes cried when she thought Elijah was asleep. These were the things that made her his mother, not the sanitized version people kept describing. Ms. Purley seemed to sense his discomfort. After lunch, when the house was momentarily empty of visitors, she nudged him gently. "Go on upstairs for a bit," she said. "Get some air. I'll handle things down here." Grateful for the escape, Elijah retreated to his room, but the walls felt too close, the air too still. Across the hall, his mother's childhood bedroom door stood ajar, tempting him with its emptiness. Without fully deciding to, Elijah found himself crossing the threshold. The room was a time capsule from his mother's youth. Faded posters of 90s musicians clung to the walls. A collection of trophies from high school track meets gathered dust on a shelf. The bed was neatly made with a quilt Ms. Purley had sewn before Elijah was born. He sat on the edge of it, running his fingers over the fabric, wondering how many nights his mother had slept here, dreaming of her future. A framed photo on the nightstand caught his eye. His mother at 16, hair in braids, arms thrown around two smiling friends at what looked like a school dance. Elijah picked it up, studying her young face. Even then, she'd had that determined look in her eyes, the one he knew so well. As he set the frame back down, he noticed the drawer of the nightstand was slightly open. Curious, he pulled it open further. Inside was a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, a few costume jewelry pieces, and beneath them a leather-bound journal. Elijah recognized it immediately. His mother had carried this journal everywhere when he was younger, jotting down thoughts, recipes, and stories from her own grandmother. In recent years, as work demanded more of her time, the journal had disappeared from daily view. He'd assumed she'd stopped writing in it. He lifted it carefully, feeling like an intruder but unable to resist. The leather was soft with age, the edges of the pages worn from frequent turning. He opened it to a random page and saw his mother's handwriting, slightly slanted to the right, letters pressed firmly into the paper. A passage about him caught his eye. Elijah lost his first tooth today. He was so proud, holding it up like a trophy. I told him about our tradition of burying baby teeth in the garden, so they'd grow into wisdom for the child. He insisted we plant his tooth under the rose bush. My grandmother would have approved. Elijah smiled faintly at the memory. He'd forgotten about planting his tooth, but now recalled how seriously his mother had taken the small ceremony, singing a soft song in a language he didn't understand as they patted the soil down. He flipped through more pages, finding recipes, dreams, worries about money, and throughout it all, references to traditions passed down through generations. His mother had written extensively about her efforts to maintain connections to her heritage, despite being raised in America, far from her ancestral homeland. Near the back of the journal, a folded page slipped out. It was different from the others, photocopied from a book, the edges crisp despite its age. Elijah unfolded it carefully. The title at the top read, "Traditional Funeral Rites of the Asante, People." Below was a detailed description of ceremonies meant to honor the dead and guide their spirits to the ancestral realm. Elijah read with growing interest about washing rituals, special clothing, and community gatherings. One paragraph stood out, marked with his mother's distinctive asterisks in the margin. Perhaps the most sacred aspect of preparing the deceased for their journey is the ritual of nsuo ano, or water for the journey. A specific mixture of herbs, honey, and spring water is prepared by a family elder and placed in the mouth of the deceased before burial. This final act of nourishment symbolizes the family's commitment to sustaining their loved one even in death, and ensures the spirit will have strength for its journey to the ancestral realm. Below the paragraph, his mother had written in her own hand, "Grandma Rose performed this for Grandpa Joseph before his burial. She taught me the mixture, equal parts dried mint, crushed lavender, and powdered ginger root, mixed with raw honey and spring water. She said without this ritual, a spirit might become confused, unable to find its way home." Elijah sat very still, reading the passage again. His mother had never mentioned this specific ritual to him, but he recalled how she'd always emphasized the importance of proper respects for the dead. When a distant uncle had passed, she'd insisted on traveling back to her hometown for the funeral, saying some things couldn't be skipped, no matter the inconvenience. With trembling fingers, he turned the page. There, in his mother's careful handwriting, was a detailed recipe for the mixture, along with the words of a prayer to be spoken during the ritual. She'd even drawn a small diagram showing how the mixture should be applied. A cold feeling settled in Elijah's stomach. Tomorrow was the viewing at Johnson's funeral home. The day after, his mother would be buried in Greenwood Cemetery with only the standard service they could afford. No one had mentioned special rituals or traditional ceremonies. He thought of his grandmother's phone conversation about money, about basic services. He understood now that traditional rites would cost extra, money they simply didn't have. His mother would be buried without the ceremonies she had valued, the connections to her heritage she had worked so hard to maintain. From downstairs came the sound of the front door opening, voices once again filling the house. Elijah quickly folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, returning the journal to its place in the drawer. As he did, his eyes fell on a small wooden box pushed to the back of the drawer. Curious, he pulled it forward and opened it. Inside were small glass bottles containing dried herbs and plants, each labeled in his mother's handwriting. Mint, lavender, ginger root. A larger jar contained what looked like honey, golden and thick. These were the ingredients from the ritual, carefully preserved. Elijah's heart pounded. His mother had kept everything needed for the ritual, perhaps planning to use it someday for her own parents. The thought that she might need it herself had probably never crossed her mind. "Elijah, you up there, baby?" Ms. Purley's voice called from the bottom of the stairs. "Pastor Wilson is here. He wants to talk about readings for the service." "Coming, Grandma," Elijah called back, quickly closing the box and pushing it back into place. That night, long after the last visitors had left and Ms. Purley had gone to bed, Elijah lay awake thinking about what he'd discovered. The photocopied page burned in his pocket where he'd hidden it. In his mind, he could hear his mother's voice clearly. "Our people know how to honor death. The living have a responsibility to help prepare the way." What would happen to his mother's spirit without the proper rituals? Would it wander, lost and confused, unable to find peace? The thought was unbearable. Outside his window, the moon cast silver light across his bedroom floor. In its glow, Elijah made a decision. If money was the problem, he would find another way. His mother had always taught him that where there's a will, there's a way. He slipped out of bed and pulled his backpack from the closet. Inside was his school allowance, $17.43, saved over several weeks. Not much, but maybe enough for whatever ingredients might be missing from his mother's collection. He'd need to check the wooden box again, make sure everything was still usable. But a bigger question loomed. Even if he could prepare the mixture, how would he administer it? His mother's body wasn't at home where he could access it easily. She was at the morgue, or would be moved to the funeral home soon. Elijah sat on the edge of his bed, determination hardening into resolve. He would find a way. For his mother, who had sacrificed so much for him, who had worked so hard to keep their heritage alive, he would find a way to perform this one final act of love. He pulled out his mother's phone, which Ms. Purley had given him to keep. Opening the browser, he typed, "County Morgue location." As the search results appeared, Elijah felt a strange calm settle over him. What he was considering might be against the rules, might even be illegal, but in his heart he knew it was right. His mother deserved to journey home properly. And Elijah would make sure that happened, no matter what. Morning came too quickly. Elijah had barely slept, his mind racing with half-formed plans and worries. When he finally dragged himself downstairs, Ms. Purley was already on the phone with the funeral home, confirming details for tomorrow's viewing. She covered the receiver when she saw him. "There's cereal on the table, baby. Eat something, please." Elijah nodded, pouring himself a bowl of cornflakes he knew he wouldn't finish. His stomach felt twisted with nerves. As he picked at his breakfast, he overheard his grandmother's conversation. "Yes, she's at the county morgue until this afternoon. Then you'll transport her for the viewing tomorrow." "I understand. The county morgue. So that's where his mother was now." Elijah pulled out his phone under the table, searching for the address. County Medical Examiner's Office, 1220 Westfield Drive. It wasn't far, maybe 4 miles from their house, on the edge of downtown. After breakfast, Elijah slipped back upstairs, telling his grandmother he needed to rest. Instead, He eased open the door to his mother's childhood bedroom and went straight to the nightstand. The wooden box of herbs was still there, pushed to the back of the drawer. He carefully removed it and examined the contents. The bottles were old but sealed tight. The mint and lavender looked usable, though the ginger had hardened into a solid mass. The honey thankfully never went bad. His mother had taught him that. He would need fresh spring water, though, and a container to mix everything in. Elijah emptied his school backpack, placing the bottles carefully inside. He added the folded paper with the ritual instructions and a small measuring spoon from the kitchen. Looking around the room, his eyes fell on a small glass bottle that had held his mother's favorite perfume. She'd kept it even after it was empty because she liked the shape. It would be perfect for holding the mixture. Next, he needed to figure out how to get to the morgue. Walking would take too long, and he couldn't ask for a ride without explaining where he was going. The city bus might work. He'd taken it with his mother plenty of times. He checked the routes on his phone and found one that stopped 3 blocks from the morgue. But getting there was only part of the challenge. How would he get inside? And how would he find his mother once he was in? Elijah realized he needed more information. "Grandma," he called downstairs, "I'm going to walk to the corner store for some air. Is that okay?" "Take your phone," she called back. "And don't be long. The Hendersons are coming by at 2. The corner store was in the opposite direction from the bus stop, but Elijah knew his grandmother wouldn't check. He felt a pang of guilt for the deception but pushed it aside. This was too important. Instead of the store, Elijah walked to the bus stop and caught the Nari 17 downtown. 20 minutes later, he got off 3 blocks from the county medical examiner's office. His heart pounded as he approached the building, a square gray structure with few windows and a small parking lot to one side. Elijah didn't dare go inside. Instead, he found a bench across the street where he could watch the building while pretending to play on his phone. For an hour, he observed. Delivery trucks came to a side entrance. Staff in scrubs occasionally stepped out for smoke breaks. A security guard checked IDs at the main entrance. As Elijah watched, he noticed patterns. The delivery entrance was left propped open for several minutes after each truck arrived. The security guard took regular breaks, disappearing for about 10 minutes each hour. Between 3 and 4 p.m., the building seemed quietest, with fewer people coming and going. His phone buzzed, a text from his grandmother asking where he was. Reluctantly, Elijah headed back to the bus stop. He had more planning to do. That evening, after another parade of visitors bearing casseroles and sympathy, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his grandmother. She looked exhausted, the lines around her eyes deeper than ever. "The viewing is tomorrow at 4, she said, pushing a pamphlet from Johnson's funeral home toward him. "Then the burial Thursday morning." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "Grandma, where is Mom right now?" "Like, exactly?" Miss Purley sighed. "She's at the county morgue, baby. They'll take her to the funeral home tomorrow morning to prepare her." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I know it's hard to think about, but they're treating her with respect. Did Mom ever talk to you about traditional rituals from our heritage?" Elijah asked carefully. Ms. Purley's eyes softened. She was always interested in those old ways. Her grandmother, my mother, taught her a lot before she passed. Did she ever mention something called in suo anno? Water for the journey? His grandmother's hand trembled slightly. "Where did you hear about that?" "I found Mom's journal. She wrote about it." Ms. Purley was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, it's an old tradition. The final act of care for the deceased. My mother performed it for my father." She looked away. "I wanted to do it for your mother, but these American funeral homes, they have rules. And it costs extra for special handling. We just don't have the money, Elijah." "I understand," Elijah said, though a plan was already forming in his mind. That night, after his grandmother went to bed, Elijah retrieved his backpack and emptied the contents on his bed. He still needed fresh ginger and spring water. The corner store would have ginger, but for real spring water, he'd need to go to the grocery store across town. He checked his savings, $17.43, enough for supplies, plus bus fare. Tomorrow, while his grandmother was busy with funeral arrangements, he would get what he needed. Then during the quiet period he'd observed at the morgue, he would find a way inside. But there was still one problem. How would he locate his mother once he was in the building? He needed more information about how morgues worked. Elijah spent the next hour researching on his phone. He learned that bodies were kept in refrigerated drawers, usually with identification tags. There might be a chart or computer system showing which drawer contained which person. It wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible. Sleep came fitfully that night. Elijah dreamed of his mother, not as she'd been in life, but as a lost spirit wandering confused through empty halls, calling his name. He woke before dawn, his pillow damp with tears. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. While Ms. Purley met with the pastor about the funeral service, Elijah made his excuses and caught the bus to the grocery store. He bought fresh ginger and a small bottle of spring water, carefully counting out his money at the register. The cashier gave him a curious look but didn't comment. Back home, Elijah locked himself in the bathroom and prepared the mixture according to his mother's instructions. Equal parts dried mint, crushed lavender, and grated fresh ginger mixed with a spoonful of honey and spring water. As he worked, he whispered the prayer written in his mother's journal, practicing the unfamiliar words until they felt natural on his tongue. The final mixture filled the small perfume bottle perfectly. Elijah sealed it tight and tucked it into his pocket, where he could feel its weight against his leg, a reminder of his purpose. Throughout the day, more visitors came and went. Elijah accepted their condolences mechanically, his mind elsewhere. At 2 o'clock, Ms. Purley left to finalize arrangements at the funeral home. The viewing wouldn't start until 4, which gave Elijah his window of opportunity. "I need some time alone," he told his grandmother as she prepared to leave. "I'll walk over to the funeral home later." "Are you sure, baby? I can have Mrs. Washington drive you." "I'm sure. I just need to think." Once she was gone, Elijah changed into dark jeans and a plain black hoodie, clothes that wouldn't stand out but also wouldn't easily identify him. He placed the bottle of ritual mixture securely in his inner pocket and put his phone on silent mode. Before leaving, he stood in front of the small altar his grandmother had created. In the living room, a framed photo of his mother surrounded by candles and flowers. "I'm going to help you find your way home," he whispered to her image. "I promise." The bus ride downtown felt surreal. Normal people doing normal things. A woman with groceries, teenagers laughing over phones, an old man reading a newspaper, while Elijah's heart pounded with the weight of his secret mission. He got off at the stop near the morgue and walked the final 3 blocks with his hood up, hands in his pockets. From his observation spot across the street, Elijah watched the building. Just as he'd noticed yesterday, activity slowed around 3 o'clock. A delivery truck pulled up to the side entrance and a worker propped the door open with a brick while unloading boxes. Elijah waited, counting his breaths to stay calm. When the delivery man went inside with a stack of boxes, leaving the door ajar, Elijah knew it was time. He crossed the street quickly but casually, not running, not drawing attention. Just a kid walking purposefully, nothing suspicious. As he approached the propped open door, Elijah's resolve nearly faltered. What he was about to do was illegal. If caught, there would be serious consequences. But then he thought of his mother's spirit, lost and confused without the proper ritual to guide her home, and his determination returned. With one last look around to ensure no one was watching, Elijah slipped through the open door and into the county morgue. The door closed behind Elijah with a soft click that seemed to echo in the empty hallway. He froze, waiting for shouts or alarms, but only silence greeted him. The corridor was dimly lit and smelled strongly of chemicals that made his eyes water slightly. The floor was smooth concrete, painted a pale green that reminded him of his elementary school. For a moment, Elijah considered turning back. This place felt wrong, too quiet, too cold, too sterile for the living. But the weight of the small bottle in his pocket reminded him why he was here. Taking a deep breath, he moved forward. The delivery entrance opened into a back hallway lined with storage rooms. Elijah passed a janitor's closet, a room full of medical supplies, and an empty break room with a half-finished cup of coffee on the table. He walked quietly, his sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. At the end of the hall, a set of double doors bore a sign, "Authorized personnel only." Elijah hesitated, then pushed gently on one door. It swung open easily. The room beyond was larger and brighter, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. Metal tables gleamed under the harsh lighting, their surfaces clean but bearing faint stains that told of their purpose. Elijah looked away quickly, focusing instead on another door across the room. Cold storage. That had to be where they kept the bodies. His mother. As Elijah crossed the room, he heard voices approaching from a connecting hallway. Panic shot through him. He ducked behind a tall metal cabinet just as two people in scrubs entered, deep in conversation. Should be done by 5. The funeral home is picking her up at 4:30, a woman's voice said. Wilson? That's the aneurysm case, right? Asked a man. Elijah's breath caught. They were talking about his mother. Yeah, shame, she was young. Got a kid too, from what I heard. Always the hardest ones. Drawer 23, I'll handle the paperwork if you do the transfer prep. Deal, I'll grab coffee first. Want some? The voices moved away, followed by the sound of a door opening and closing. Elijah waited, counting slowly to 60 before peering around the cabinet. The room was empty again. Drawer 23. His mother was in drawer 23. Elijah moved quickly to the cold storage door. It was heavier than he expected, requiring both hands to pull open. Cold air rushed out, raising goosebumps on his arms as he stepped inside. The cold storage room was exactly as he'd imagined from his research. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls, each bearing a small numbered tag. Elijah scanned them, heart pounding. 80 Nidawari. There, along the far wall, 23. A clipboard hanging on the wall caught his eye. It contained a chart listing names and drawer numbers. He found his mother's name. Wilson Vivian, 34, drawer 23, confirming what he'd overheard. Elijah approached drawer 23 slowly. His hands trembled as he grasped the handle. For a second he couldn't move, suddenly terrified of what he would see. His mother had always been so full of life. Her laugh, her voice, the way she danced around the kitchen. How could all that be contained in a cold metal drawer? I can do this, he whispered to himself. For Mom. He pulled the drawer open. The body lay covered with a thin white sheet. Only the outline was visible. Shoulders, the curve of a nose, feet pointing slightly outward the way his mother's always did. Elijah stood frozen, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Slowly, carefully, he folded the sheet back just enough to reveal his mother's face. She looked peaceful but strange, not like his mother at all. Her skin was a different shade than he remembered, her features somehow sharper and softer at the same time. Someone had closed her eyes, but not quite right. His mother's eyes had always crinkled slightly at the corners, even in sleep. Tears blurred Elijah's vision. He wiped them away with his sleeve, needing to see clearly for what came next. With shaking hands, he removed the small bottle from his pocket and unscrewed the cap. The scent of mint and lavender mixed with honey rose up, briefly overpowering the clinical smells of the morgue. It smelled like home, like the remedies his mother used to make when he was sick. From his other pocket, he pulled out the folded paper with the ritual instructions. Though he had memorized the words, he wanted to be sure he got everything right. This would be his only chance. According to the instructions, he needed to recite the prayer while administering the mixture. Elijah took a deep breath and began to whisper the words his mother had written down, her handwriting a lifeline connecting him to her even now. Spirit of my ancestor, prepare for your journey home. May this offering guide you to those who have gone before. May it strengthen you for the path ahead. May it remind you of our love, which follows you even beyond death. As he spoke, Elijah carefully tipped the bottle, allowing a small amount of the mixture to flow between his mother's lips. The honey made it thick, ensuring it stayed where he placed it rather than spilling. We honor your life among us. We release you to find peace. We promise to carry your memory forward. Go with our blessing. Go with our love. Tears fell freely now, dropping onto the sheet as Elijah completed the ritual. He stood for a moment in silence, one hand resting gently on his mother's cold cheek. I love you, Mom, he whispered. I hope this helps you find your way home. The sudden sound of a door opening in the outer room jolted Elijah back to reality. Voices approached, the same ones he'd heard earlier. They were coming for his mother to prepare her for transfer to the funeral home. Panic gripped him. He quickly replaced the sheet, closed the bottle, and looked around desperately for somewhere to hide. The cold storage room had no cabinets or curtains, nowhere to conceal himself. The only option was to slip out and hope he could make it back to the exit before being seen. Elijah closed drawer 23 gently, whispering a final goodbye. Then he moved to the cold storage door and eased it open just enough to peer out. The two workers had their backs to him, preparing one of the metal tables. This was his chance. Elijah slipped through the door and began to edge along the wall toward the exit. He had almost reached the double doors when one of the workers turned. "Hey, who are you? What are you doing in here?" Elijah froze, his mind racing. Running would only make things worse. Slowly, he turned to face the man who had called out to him. The worker was middle-aged with graying hair and tired eyes. He wore blue scrubs and a confused expression that quickly turned to concern as he took in Elijah's appearance. A young boy, clearly out of place in a morgue. "This is a restricted area, son." "How did you get in here?" Before Elijah could answer, the female worker turned as well. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, are you Vivian Wilson's boy? I saw your picture in her wallet when we logged her personal effects." Elijah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The male worker's face softened. "You shouldn't be here, kid. This isn't a place for children." "I had to," Elijah finally managed. "I had to say goodbye properly." Understanding dawned on both their faces. The woman approached slowly, as if afraid of startling him. Did you find her?" Elijah nodded again, tears threatening once more. "Drawer 23. The two workers exchanged a look that Elijah couldn't quite read. Then the man sighed deeply and pulled up a rolling stool. "Sit down, son. I'm supposed to call security, but let's talk first." Elijah sat, his legs suddenly weak. He expected anger, accusations, threats of punishment. Instead, the man leaned against the table, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. "My name's Mr. Ray. That's Miss Tina. We take care of people who've passed until their families can lay them to rest." His voice was gentler than Elijah had expected. "We're not supposed to let family in like this. There are rules, procedures." "I know," Elijah said quietly, "but I had to do something important. Something that couldn't wait." Ms. Tina pulled up another stool. "What was so important that you broke into a morgue, honey?" Elijah hesitated, then decided on the truth. "A ritual, from my mother's homeland. It's called Ensuo Ano, water for the journey. It helps guide her spirit home." He pulled out the small bottle, now half empty. "I made this mixture. It's supposed to be placed in her mouth before burial." Instead of laughing or dismissing him, Mr. Ray nodded slowly. "I understand. When my father passed, my grandmother insisted on placing coins in his hands before the funeral home took him. Said it was our way for generations." "Did you get to do what you needed to do?" Ms. Tina asked quietly. Elijah nodded. "Yes. Thank you for not calling security right away." "Well, we still have a problem," Mr. Ray said, though his tone remained kind. "You're not supposed to be here, and I'm guessing your family doesn't know where you are." "My grandmother would never have let me come," Elijah admitted. "But I couldn't let Mom go without this. It was important to her." Even if she never said it directly. Ms. Tina checked her watch. "The funeral home is sending someone in 30 minutes. We need to get you out of here before then." She looked at Mr. Ray. "Maybe we don't need to make this official. The boy didn't damage anything or disturb any other patients. He just wanted to honor his mother." Mr. Ray rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Your grandmother is probably worried sick about you. Do you have a phone?" Elijah pulled out his phone. The screen showed 5 missed calls from Miss Purley. "Call her," Mr. Ray said. "Tell her you're safe and on your way to the funeral home. Don't mention where you've been. That'll just upset her more. Then Ms. Tina will drive you there." Relief washed over Elijah. "You're not going to report me?" "Sometimes rules need bending," Mr. Ray said quietly. "I lost my mother when I was young too. I know what it's like to need closure. Just promise me you won't do anything like this again." "I promise," Elijah said solemnly. As he dialed his grandmother's number, Elijah felt a strange peace settle over him. He had completed the ritual. His mother's spirit would find its way home. And somehow in the process he had found unexpected kindness in this cold, sterile place. Ms. Tina gently placed a hand on his shoulder as he waited for his grandmother to answer. "Your mom would be proud of you, you know. It takes courage to do what you did today." Elijah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. But deep inside he felt that Ms. Tina was right. His mother would understand. She had always taught him that love sometimes requires breaking the rules. Ms. Tina's car smelled of vanilla air freshener and coffee. She drove carefully, checking her rearview mirror every few seconds as if worried someone might be following them. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, his grandmother's worried voice still ringing in his ears from their brief phone call. "You okay, honey?" Miss Tina asked, glancing at him as they waited at a red light. Elijah nodded. The small bottle that had contained the ritual mixture was back in his pocket, now empty. His mission was complete. The weight that had pressed on his chest since finding his mother's journal had lifted, replaced by a strange calmness. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for driving me, and for not calling security." Ms. Tina's smile was kind. Sometimes the rules aren't as important as doing right by the people we love. She hesitated, then added, "Your mother came through our department a few times in her work as a nurse. She always treated everyone with respect, the living and the dead. I think she'd appreciate what you did today." The thought that his mother might have known these people, might have walked those same hallways in life, had never occurred to Elijah. It made the cold morgue seem less foreign somehow. Johnson's funeral home came into view, a large Victorian house painted pale blue with white trim, its parking lot already half full. Ms. Tina pulled up to the entrance. "Your grandmother's probably inside already," she said. "Remember, we agreed not to mention where you've been. Just say you needed some time alone before coming." "I remember," Elijah promised. Before he could open the door, Ms. Tina touched his arm lightly. "What you did took courage. Your mother raised a good boy." Tears pricked at Elijah's eyes, but he blinked them back. "Thank you for understanding." Inside the funeral home, soft music played from hidden speakers. The air smelled of flowers and furniture polish. A man in a dark suit approached as soon as Elijah entered. "You must be Elijah Wilson. Your grandmother has been asking for you." His voice was professionally sympathetic. "The viewing room is just through there." Elijah followed the man's gesture toward a set of open double doors. Inside, people stood in small groups speaking in hushed tones. At the front of the room, surrounded by flower arrangements, was a polished wooden casket. His grandmother spotted him immediately. She hurried over, relief and worry battling on her face. "Where have you been?" she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I was about to call the police when I'm sorry, Grandma. I just needed to walk and think before coming here." The lie tasted bitter, but Elijah knew the truth would only upset her more. Ms. Purley studied his face. "You look different. Older somehow." Elijah didn't know how to respond to that. He felt different, as if the boy who had slipped into the morgue was not quite the same one who had emerged. "Come on," his grandmother said gently. "People want to pay their respects, and you should see your mother." Elijah let her guide him toward the casket. He had been dreading this moment, afraid of what he would feel seeing his mother again, this time with others watching. But as they approached, he realized he had already said his real goodbye, in the cold quiet of drawer 23, with the ritual words on his lips and the sacred mixture in his hands. His mother lay in the casket, dressed in her favorite blue dress, her hands folded peacefully over her stomach. The funeral home had done their work well. She looked more like herself than she had in the morgue, though still not quite right. Something essential was missing, something no amount of makeup or careful positioning could recreate. Ms. Purley wiped tears from her eyes. "Doesn't she look beautiful? Just like she's sleeping?" Elijah nodded, unable to speak. He knew his mother wasn't there, not really. Her spirit was already on its journey home, guided by the ritual he had performed. This was just a shell, an empty vessel that had once housed the woman who had raised him, laughed with him, taught him to be proud of his heritage. The viewing passed in a blur of faces and voices. Relatives he barely recognized, his mother's co-workers from the hospital, neighbors and church members, all offering condolences he could hardly process. Several people remarked on how mature he seemed, how strong. "You're the man of the family now," his great-uncle told him, a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would be proud." Elijah nodded politely, though the words rang hollow. He didn't feel like a man. He felt like a boy who had broken into a morgue because he couldn't bear the thought of his mother's spirit being lost. As the evening wore on, Elijah found himself sitting alone in a corner, watching as people paid their final respects. A movement at the entrance caught his eye. Mr. Ray from the morgue, now dressed in a suit rather than scrubs, slipping quietly into the room. Their eyes met across the space, and Mr. Ray gave a small nod of acknowledgement before approaching the casket to pay his respects. Later, as the crowd thinned and Ms. Purley was busy speaking with the funeral director, Mr. Ray made his way to Elijah's corner. "How are you holding up, son?" he asked, sitting beside him. "I'm okay," Elijah said. Then more honestly, "I don't know. Everything feels strange," Mr. Ray nodded. "That's normal. Grief has a way of making the world seem different." He was quiet for a moment. "I spoke with the funeral director, an old friend of mine. Made sure everything was handled with proper respect. Thank you," Elijah said, understanding the unspoken message. Mr. Ray had ensured the funeral. Home didn't discover evidence of Elijah's ritual. "I have something for you." Mr. Ray reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. "Your mother's personal effects. Normally they'd go to your grandmother, but I thought you might want this one thing first." He pressed something into Elijah's palm, a smooth stone pendant on a leather cord. Elijah recognized it immediately. His mother had worn it always tucked beneath her clothes. She told him it came from her grandmother's village in the old country. "She would want you to have it," Mr. Ray said gently, "to remember." Tears spilled down Elijah's cheeks as he closed his fingers around the pendant. "How did you know?" "Just a feeling," Mr. Ray said, standing. "Take care, Elijah Wilson. Your mother raised a brave son." The burial service the next morning was brief but dignified. Under a clear autumn sky, Elijah and Ms. Purley stood side by side as the pastor spoke of resurrection and eternal life. Elijah fingered the stone pendant now hanging around his neck, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. As they lowered his mother's casket into the ground, Elijah whispered the final words of the ritual under his breath. No one heard him except perhaps Ms. Purley, who squeezed his hand tightly but said nothing. After the service, several elders from their community approached. Elijah recognized them as friends of his great-grandmother, keepers of the old traditions. "We heard what you did," one woman whispered, her accent thick, eyes bright with approval. At the cold place, Elijah stiffened. "How word travels," another elder said. "What matters is that you honored your mother properly. You remembered the old ways." "You've done a good thing, boy," the first woman said, pressing something into his hand, a small carved wooden figure. "For remembering what many have forgotten." Before Elijah could respond, they moved away to speak with his grandmother. He opened his hand to find a tiny carved bird, a symbol of the soul's journey in his ancestors' tradition. The days after the funeral passed slowly. Elijah returned to school, though everything felt different now. He moved through his classes like a ghost, barely hearing the teachers, nodding at friends' awkward condolences. 2 weeks after the funeral, he was called to the principal's office. Ms. Purley was there along with a police officer. His heart nearly stopped. "Elijah," the principal said gently, "Officer Davis has some questions about an incident at the county morgue." The officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, studied him carefully. "Son, we received an anonymous report about a break-in at the morgue the day of your mother's viewing. The report suggested you might have been involved." Elijah's mouth went dry. He glanced at his grandmother, whose expression revealed nothing. "I'd like to hear your side of the story," Officer Davis continued. Taking a deep breath, Elijah told the truth about finding his mother's journal, learning of the ritual, and his determination to honor her properly. He explained about the ingredients, the prayer, the journey to the morgue. He didn't mention Ms. Tina or Mr. Ray. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then Officer Davis nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty. What you did was against the law, trespassing, unauthorized entry. But given the circumstances, I think community service would be more appropriate than formal charges." Relief washed over Elijah. "Community service?" 20 hours at the Cultural Center downtown, Officer Davis said. "They have a program preserving traditional practices of various cultures. I think you might have something to contribute." Later, as they drove home, Ms. Purley finally spoke about what happened. "I knew," she said quietly. "Not right away, but when Mr. Ray showed up at the viewing, I figured it out. He and I spoke afterward. Are you angry?" Elijah asked. Ms. Purley was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to perform that ritual for your mother myself, but I was afraid of breaking rules, of seeming strange to these American funeral people." She glanced at him. "You were braver than me. Your mother would be proud." 6 years later, Elijah Wilson stood in a hospital corridor, a white coat over his shoulders, a stethoscope around his neck. The stone pendant from his mother still hung beneath his shirt. As a first-year medical student doing hospital rotations, He had seen much of life and death already. Today, he was making a special presentation to the hospital board, a proposal for integrating cultural death rituals into standard hospital protocols. His research had shown that allowing families to perform traditional practices improved their ability to process grief and reduce long-term psychological trauma. Medicine isn't just about treating the body, he told the attentive board members. It's about respecting the whole person, their beliefs, their traditions, their spiritual needs. When we make space for cultural practices around death, we heal not just patients but families and communities. As he spoke, Elijah thought of Drawer 23 of the quiet morgue, of the ritual that had given him peace during the darkest moment of his life. The boy who broke into the morgue had grown into a man determined to build bridges between worlds, medical and spiritual, traditional and modern. And somewhere, he believed, his mother was proud.